The morning sun had barely touched the ancient stone walls of Windsor Castle when the silence shattered. The voice echoed across the courtyard, sharp, furious, royal. King Charles stood frozen, his face red with anger, pointing directly at a young guardsman who looked like he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. Tourists stopped mid-step. Cameras turned. Whispers rippled through the crowd like wildfire. No one had ever seen the king like this. The guardsman, barely 23 years old, stood at attention in his scarlet tunic and bearskin hat. His name was Thomas Brennan. He'd dreamed of this position since childhood. Trained for years, earned every stripe on his uniform. But right now, in front of hundreds of witnesses, he felt smaller than he'd ever felt in his life. Before we continue, if you love stories that pull at your heartstrings and show real human moments, hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what happens next. Charles took 3 deliberate steps forward. His security team tensed. The morning air felt electric. Every eye watched the king's face twist with something between disappointment and rage. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Charles demanded. Thomas swallowed hard. His throat felt like sandpaper. He'd been standing guard for 4 hours already. The morning shift. Same position he'd held for 6 months, without a single mistake. But something had gone wrong. Something he hadn't even fully realized yet. The crowd pressed closer. Phone cameras captured everything. In minutes, this moment would be trending worldwide. But Thomas couldn't think about that. All he could feel was the king's burning stare. "Your Majesty," Thomas began, his voice cracking. "Silence." Charles snapped. The word cut through the air like a blade. A woman in the crowd gasped. A child started crying. The other guards stood like statues, unable to help, bound by protocol and duty. Charles moved closer still, close enough that Thomas could see the veins in his neck, close enough to see his hands trembling with anger. Or was it something else? "You were given one responsibility," Charles said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried across the entire courtyard. "One simple task, and you failed." Thomas felt his chest tighten. His mind raced backward through the morning. What had he missed? The ceremony had gone perfectly. The changing of the guard, the inspections, everything by the book, everything precise, hadn't it? Then he saw it. The king's eyes weren't looking at him. They were looking past him, at something behind him, something at his post. Thomas's blood ran cold. His post. The Eastern Gate, the most sacred entrance to Windsor Castle, the one place that required absolute vigilance, the one place where nothing, absolutely nothing, could ever be overlooked. And in that split second, Thomas remembered 20 minutes ago, a delivery van had approached. The driver had papers. Official-looking papers, said he was running late. Asked if Thomas could just quickly check the manifest and wave him through. Said the kitchen was waiting for fresh supplies. Thomas had glanced at the paperwork. Everything seemed legitimate. He'd nodded. Stepped aside. Let the van pass, but he hadn't called it in. Hadn't verified through command. Hadn't followed protocol, and now the King of England stood before him, shaking with fury, and Thomas understood why. "Tell me, Guardsman Brennan," Charles said, his voice like ice now. "Where exactly is that delivery van right now?" The question hung in the air. Thomas opened his mouth. No words came out. Because he didn't know. The van had disappeared into the castle grounds, and no one had any idea what was inside it. The silence that followed felt like hours, though it lasted only seconds. Charles turned sharply to his security detail. Lock down the castle. Now. 2 agents spoke urgently into their radios. Within moments, alarms blared. Gates slammed shut. The tourists who seconds ago had been filming with delight now looked around in confusion and growing fear. Thomas stood rooted to the spot. His heart hammered against his ribs. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. "Your Majesty, I checked the papers," Thomas said desperately. They looked official. The driver had identification. He said, "I don't care what he said." Charles wheeled around, his face now pale beneath the anger. You don't make assumptions at Windsor Castle, guardsman. You follow protocol, always, without exception. Senior officer rushed over, saluting crisply. Sir, we've located the vehicle. West Courtyard. Near the kitchens? And the driver? Charles demanded.
Under.
Vehicle's empty. The words hit like a physical blow. Empty. The driver had vanished into the castle. A stranger, unverified, unknown. Inside the most secure royal residence in Britain. Charles closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, Thomas saw something that shook him more than the anger. He saw fear. Evacuate the castle, Charles ordered quietly. Everyone. Staff, visitors, family, activate emergency protocols. Thomas watched as chaos erupted in controlled bursts. Security teams fanned out and practiced formations. Tourists were herded toward exits by calm but firm officers. Staff emerged from doorways, confused and frightened. And through it all, Charles stood perfectly still, watching his home being torn apart because of one mistake. Your Majesty, please? Thomas tried again. His voice broke. I'm so sorry. I didn't think. No, Charles interrupted, turning to face him fully. You didn't think, and that's precisely the problem. The king took a breath. His anger seemed to shift into something heavier, something sadder. Do you know what happened at Westminster in 1974? Charles asked suddenly. Thomas blinked, caught off guard. No, sir. A bomb, Charles said flatly. Placed by someone who talked their way past security. 17 injured. It could have been catastrophic, he paused. Or 1982. A man named Michael Fagan climbed into my mother's bedroom at Buckingham Palace. Sat on her bed, talked to her. Because someone didn't follow protocol. Each word landed like a hammer. These aren't just rules, Guardsman Brennan. They're written in the blood and terror of every security breach that came before. They exist because people died. Because families were destroyed. Because one moment of carelessness can end everything. Thomas felt tears burning behind his eyes. Not for himself. For what he'd risked. For everyone in the castle whose lives he'd endangered with one lazy decision. I understand, Your Majesty, he whispered. Do you? Charles stepped closer. His voice dropped. Right now, somewhere in this castle, there's a man we know nothing about. He could be planting explosives. He could be opening doors for others. He could be a sharp crack echoed from inside the castle. Everyone froze. It wasn't a gunshot. It was subtler, like glass breaking, or metal striking stone. Charles's security immediately surrounded him, hands on weapons, ready to move him to safety. No, Charles said firmly. I'm not leaving. This is my home, sir. Protocol requires, I said. No. The king's voice carried absolute authority. Find that man, now. Teams sprinted into the castle. Radio chatter filled the air. Thomas stood helplessly, still at attention, watching the nightmare unfold. Minutes crawled by. Then a voice crackled over the radio. Subject spotted. North wing. Second floor. In pursuit, Charles listened intently, his jaw tight. He's carrying something, the voice continued. Can't identify. He's moving fast. Thomas felt sick. Carrying something. A weapon? A bomb? This was his fault. All his fault. Another voice broke in. He's cornered. East Library. Requesting permission to engage. Charles grabbed the radio from his security chief. Do not engage. Secure the area. I'm coming up, Your Majesty. You can't, the security chief started. He's in my home, Charles said coldly. In my library. Whatever he wants, he'll answer to me. And before anyone could stop him, the King of England walked straight into Windsor Castle toward an unknown threat. While the whole world watched outside, Thomas stood alone in the courtyard, his future destroyed, wondering if he'd just helped orchestrate a tragedy that would echo through history. The East Library sat on the second floor, overlooking the castle gardens. Tall windows. Ancient books. Portraits of kings and queens dating back centuries. It was Charles's favorite room in the entire castle. And now, a stranger stood in its center. Surrounded by armed security, Charles entered quietly, his footsteps muffled by thick carpet. 6 security officers had their weapons trained on a man in his mid-50s, dressed in a simple delivery uniform. He clutched something against his chest. A package. Wrapped in brown paper? "Don't move," one officer commanded. The man didn't move. But he was crying. Charles stopped just inside the doorway. He studied the man's face. Weathered skin. Gray hair. Trembling hands. This wasn't a terrorist. This was someone broken. "What's your name?" Charles asked softly. The security chief looked at him sharply. "Your Majesty, we should—" Charles raised a hand for silence. "What's your name?" he repeated. The man's voice came out hoarse. David Morrison." "And what are you doing in my library, David?" David's tears fell faster now. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't know how else to," his voice broke. "I needed to see you, so you lied to my guard. Infiltrated my home? I didn't mean harm," David said desperately. "I just needed you to understand. To see." "To put down the package," an officer ordered. David clutched it tighter. "No, please, this is why I came. This is everything." Weapons tensed. Fingers moved toward triggers. The air crackled with danger. Charles took a step forward. His security team shifted nervously, but he ignored them. "What's in the package, David?" "The truth," David whispered. "The truth they wouldn't let me tell you." Charles moved closer still, close enough to see the exhaustion in David's eyes, the desperation, the absolute conviction that whatever he carried mattered more than his own life. "Then show me," Charles said gently. "Your Majesty," the security chief protested. "Let him show me." Charles repeated firmly. David's hand shook as he slowly unwrapped the brown paper. Inside was a photograph. Old, faded, creased from being held too many times. Charles took it carefully. The photograph showed a young soldier, barely 19, standing in military uniform, proud, strong, smiling at the camera. "My son," David said, his voice cracking. "James Morrison, Corporal 3rd Battalion." Charles looked up from the photograph. He was military. "He served you," David said. "Served the crown. 18 months in Afghanistan. Came home, changed, broken inside. He tried to get help. Tried to talk to someone. Anyone." Fresh tears streamed down David's face. The system failed him. The veterans' services, the hospitals, everyone failed him. Charles felt his chest tighten. "He took his own life 3 years ago," David continued. "In our garage, 21 years old. And I've been trying to make someone listen. To make them understand that our soldiers need help. Real help. But every letter I sent was ignored. Every call unreturned. Every office turned me away." He looked directly at Charles. "So I came here. I'm sorry I lied. I'm sorry I broke your rules. But I needed you to see his face. To know his name, because he served you, Your Majesty. He died for you. And the system you oversee let him die alone." The silence in the library felt sacred and terrible. Charles stared at the photograph. At this young man who'd worn a uniform, who'd stood guard just like Thomas, who'd come home and found no one standing guard for him. "How many letters did you send?" Charles asked quietly. 47, David said. "Over 3 years, to Parliament, to Veterans Affairs, to the Palace." He laughed bitterly. "I got form responses. Thank you for your concern. Your feedback is important, but nothing changed. Nothing ever changes." Charles looked at the photograph again. James Morrison, 21, gone. "You're right," Charles said finally. David blinked. "What?" "You're right. The system failed your son. It failed you. And I'm sorry." Security team exchanged confused glances. This wasn't standard protocol. None of this was. Charles turned to his security chief. "Lower your weapons." "Sir," I said, "lower them. This man isn't a threat. He's a father trying to be heard. Slowly, reluctantly, the weapons lowered. Charles looked back at David. What you did today was dangerous. And wrong. You broke laws, endangered people, caused chaos. David's shoulders slumped. No. I'm ready to face the consequences. But, Charles continued, his voice strengthening, you did something else too. You made me pay attention. You made me see what I've been blind to. And for that, I'm grateful. David stared at him in disbelief. Charles handed the photograph back carefully. Tell me everything. Every detail about James, every failure of the system, every unanswered letter. I want names, departments, documentation. You'll listen? David's voice was barely a whisper. I'll do more than listen, Charles said. I'll act. And in that moment, standing in his library with a broken father and a photograph of a fallen soldier, the King of England made a decision that would change everything. 2 hours later, Charles sat at his private desk with David Morrison across from him. The security team had wanted to arrest David immediately. Charles had refused. Not yet, he'd said firmly. Not until I hear everything. And now, David was talking. Really talking? Pouring out 3 years of anguish and unanswered questions. James was fine before deployment, David explained. He loved life. Had a girlfriend. Planned to study engineering after his service. His hands gripped a teacup that had long gone cold. But Afghanistan changed him. He saw things. Did things. Things soldiers shouldn't have to carry alone. Charles listened without interrupting. Taking notes. Recording names. He came home and couldn't sleep. Couldn't eat. Jumped at loud noises. Started drinking. His girlfriend left him because he scared her. And when he asked for help when he went to the Veterans Services, they gave him a pamphlet and an appointment 3 months away. 3 months. Charles looked up sharply. 3 months, David repeated. For someone who was drowning, who told them he was having dark thoughts. They said they'd put him on a waiting list. His voice went hollow. He didn't have 3 months. Charles set down his pen. How did you find him? David's face crumpled. Came home from work. Called for him. He didn't answer. I went to the garage, and he couldn't finish. The silence stretched, heavy with grief. I'm sorry, Charles said quietly. No parent should endure that. After the funeral, I tried to understand what went wrong, David continued, pulling himself together. I requested his records. Took months to get them. When I finally did, I saw it all there. The warning signs. The calls for help. All documented. All ignored. He pulled papers from his jacket, creased, coffee-stained, read 1,000 times. Look here. Session notes from his one therapy appointment before he died. Patient expresses suicidal ideation. Recommend immediate intervention. But the recommendation was never followed up. No one called. No one checked. He fell through every crack in the system. Charles took the papers carefully. Read them. Felt anger rising in his chest. So I started writing letters, David said. To everyone I could think of. Members of Parliament. Veterans Affairs. The Ministry of Defense. And I got nothing. Polite brush-offs. Empty promises. The bureaucracy just absorbed my pain and did nothing with it. Till today, Charles said. Until today? David agreed. When I decided rules didn't matter anymore, when I decided if I had to become a criminal to be heard, then that's what I'd do. Charles looked at him for a long moment. Then he stood and walked to the window overlooking the courtyard. Below, he could see Thomas Brennan still standing at his post, waiting for judgment. You know what's interesting about power? Charles said quietly, everyone assumes having it means you can change anything. That you can simply order things to be better, and they will be. He turned back to David. But power without awareness is meaningless. I can sign any order I want. But if I don't know where the problems are, if people like you can't reach people like me, then nothing changes. And watched him carefully. Thomas Brennan, Charles continued, the guardsman who let you through, he made a mistake today. A serious one. He broke protocol, put lives at risk. I'm sorry for that, David said. I never wanted. Charles held up a hand. But he made that mistake because he saw a father desperate to deliver something to the kitchens. He saw a human being, not a threat. He made a choice based on compassion, not procedure. He paused. It was the wrong choice. But I understand why he made it. Charles returned to his desk and picked up his phone. Dialed a number. Yes, this is the king. I need you to arrange a meeting. Every head of Veterans Affairs, Mental Health Services, Military Liaisons. Tomorrow morning, non-negotiable.
ISIS.
I don't care about schedules. Make it happen. He hung up and looked at David. You wanted action? You'll have it. But I need something from you. Anything, David said immediately. I need you to tell your story, publicly, in detail. At a hearing I'm going to arrange, I need you to put faces to these statistics, names to these failures. Charles leaned forward. Can you do that? David's eyes widened. You want me to speak? Officially, I want you to testify. To politicians, to military leadership, to anyone who needs to hear that the system is broken and people are dying because of it. Charles's voice hardened. And I want them to have to look you in the eye and explain why your son's cry for help was ignored. For the first time since entering the castle, David smiled. Not a happy smile, but one of grim determination. I'll do it, he said. I'll tell them everything. Good. Charles stood. But first, you're going to be arrested, formally, for trespassing, for breaching security, for impersonating a delivery driver. David nodded. I understand. You'll spend tonight in custody. Tomorrow, you'll be charged. But I'll personally speak on your behalf. And I suspect, given the circumstances, the court will be lenient. David stood as well. Thank you, Your Majesty, for listening, for believing me. Cute. Thank you for breaking through, Charles replied. Even if it was illegal, security officer entered. Charles nodded to him. Take Mr. Morrison into custody. Treat him with respect, and make sure he has whatever he needs. As David was led away, he turned back one last time. James would have been proud, he said softly, that his story might help others. Charles watched him go. Then he sat down heavily and picked up the photograph David had left behind. A young soldier, smiling, full of promise. Life cut short because no one was listening. Charles made himself a promise right then. That would change. Starting now. Charles walked back to the courtyard as the afternoon sun began to set. The crowds had been evacuated. The lockdown was lifting. But the weight of the day still hung heavy over Windsor Castle. Thomas Brennan still stood at his post. He'd been there for 7 hours now. No one had told him to move. No one had relieved him. He simply stood, waiting for whatever punishment was coming. Charles approached slowly. Thomas snapped to attention, his face pale. Guardsman Brennan, Charles said formally. Your Majesty? Thomas's voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed his terror. Do you know what happens to soldiers who break protocol? Yes, sir. Discharge. Possible criminal charges. Loss of pension and honor? Charles nodded slowly. All of that would be justified. What you did today was inexcusable. You endangered every person in this castle. My family. My staff. Innocent tourists. You violated the most basic principle of your duty. Thomas stared straight ahead. Yes, sir. I take full responsibility. And yet, Charles continued, his voice softening slightly, you did it because a father convinced you he needed to deliver supplies? Because you saw him as human? Because somewhere in your training and protocol, you still have compassion? Thomas blinked, confused. That compassion almost got people killed today, Charles said. But it's also what makes you a good soldier. The tension between following orders and recognizing humanity, that's the burden every guardsman carries. Charles stepped closer. Tell me something, Brennan. Why did you join the guard? The question caught Thomas off guard. Sir, why this? Why stand in the cold and heat, motionless for hours, protecting people you'll never meet? Thomas swallowed. My grandfather, sir. He served in the Coldstream Guards. Died protecting others during the Troubles in Northern Ireland. I wanted to honor him. To be someone who protects rather than harms. Charles was quiet for a moment. Your grandfather would be disappointed in your mistake today. Thomas's face fell. Yes, sir. But he'd also understand the impulse behind it. The desire to help, to trust, to see good in people. Charles paused. The world needs soldiers who remember that wars are fought for people, not just nations. Thomas didn't dare speak. You're being reassigned, Charles said finally. Thomas's heart sank. Reassignment, the gentle word for demotion. For failure, you'll be moved to the Veterans Liaison Office. Effective immediately. Thomas looked up, startled. Sir? I'm establishing a new program, Charles explained. Direct outreach to soldiers transitioning out of service. Mental health screening. Immediate intervention resources. No more waiting lists. No more bureaucracy. He looked Thomas in the eye. And I need someone who understands the cost of one missed warning sign. Someone who knows what happens when the system fails. Your Majesty, I don't understand you let someone through the gate today because you believed his story. You made the wrong call, but you cared enough to consider his humanity. Charles's voice turned stern. Now, I need you to care enough to never let another veteran slip through the cracks the way James Morrison did. Thomas felt tears threatening. I won't fail you again, sir. You will, Charles said bluntly. Everyone fails sometimes. But what matters is what you do after. How you learn. How you grow. He stepped back. You're dismissed from this post, Guardsman Brennan. Report to the Veterans Affairs Office tomorrow morning. They'll be expecting you. Thomas saluted sharply. Yes, Your Majesty. Thank you, sir. As Thomas walked away, the senior officer who'd been overseeing the incident approached Charles. Sir, if I may speak freely? Go ahead. That was ... unconventional. Reassigning him rather than dismissing him. Charles looked at the officer steadily. Today taught me something, Commander. We've built systems so focused on protocol that we've forgotten why the protocol exists. To protect people, to serve them, to honor those who serve us. But he endangered the castle. He did, Charles agreed. And he'll carry that weight forever. But punishing him doesn't fix the system that allowed David Morrison's son to die alone. It doesn't prevent the next veteran from falling through the cracks. He turned to face the commander fully. Sometimes breaking the rules is a symptom of a deeper problem. And if I only punish the symptom, nothing changes. The commander considered this. And David Morrison? What happens to him? He'll face charges. He'll pay a price for what he did. But he'll also testify. And his testimony will change policy. Charles's jaw set firmly. I'm going to make sure of it. That evening, Charles sat in his private quarters with his wife Camilla. She'd heard about the day's events, but hadn't pressed him for details until now. You could have been hurt, she said quietly. Walking into that library with an unknown person, I know. But you did it anyway. Charles looked at her. He was crying, Camilla. This man who'd broken every rule to get to me was standing there crying, holding a photograph of his dead son. How could I not go? She took his hand. You've always had too much heart for a king. Or not enough, Charles said. I've been king for years, and I didn't know this was happening. I didn't know veterans were being turned away. That suicide rates were climbing. That fathers were writing 47 letters into the void. Can't know everything. But I should know this, Charles insisted. These are men and women who serve the crown, who swear oaths, who risk their lives. And when they come home broken, we give them pamphlets and waiting lists? He shook his head. That ends now. Camilla smiled sadly. Just promise me you won't break security protocols yourself. Let your staff handle the dangerous situations. I promise to try, Charles said. But if a father desperate to be heard breaks into my home again, I'll listen. Even if it's dangerous. She squeezed his hand. I know you will. It's who you are. Charles looked out the window at the darkening sky over Windsor. Somewhere out there, other veterans were struggling. Other families were drowning. Other stories were going unheard. But not for long. Tomorrow would bring changes. Real ones. The kind that actually saved lives. And it had taken one. This man's desperate act, and one guardsman's mistake to make it happen. 3 months later, the East Library at Windsor Castle looked different. The same tall windows, the same ancient books. But now it hosted something new. A memorial dot on the wall hung a photograph. James Morrison, 21. In uniform, smiling beside it. Plaque read, "In memory of all who served and struggled to find help, your sacrifice will not be forgotten." David Morrison stood before it, tears streaming down his face. Not tears of grief this time. Tears of something else. Relief, purpose, peace. The charges against him had been reduced to a fine in community service. But Charles had given him something more valuable than leniency. He'd given him a platform. David's testimony before Parliament had been devastating. Raw, honest. He'd held up his son's medical records. Read aloud the unanswered letters. Named the departments that had failed. And he'd done it all with the king sitting in the gallery, watching. The response had been immediate. Emergency funding for veterans' mental health services. Elimination of waiting lists for active cases. 24-hour crisis hotlines. Mandatory follow-ups for anyone expressing suicidal thoughts. Real changes. Systemic changes. Changes that came too late for James but might save countless others. Charles entered the library quietly, not wanting to disturb David's moment. But David heard him and turned. "Your Majesty?" He wiped his eyes quickly. "I didn't expect you. I wanted to see it," Charles said, looking at the memorial. "To pay my respects." They stood together in silence for a moment. "The new hotline received 200 calls in the first week," Charles said finally. 12 veterans were given immediate emergency intervention. 3 said they'd been planning to end their lives that night. David closed his eyes. 3 lives. "Because you listened. Because you fought," Charles corrected. "Because you refused to let your son's death mean nothing." David looked at the photograph of James. "Do you think he'd be proud?" "Of how I did this?" Charles considered the question seriously. "I think he'd be proud that you didn't give up. That you found a way to turn pain into purpose." He paused. "Though perhaps he'd prefer you'd used a less dramatic entrance." David laughed shakily. "Yeah. Breaking into Windsor Castle probably wasn't my finest moment. But it was effective," Charles said with a slight smile. "Sometimes the world needs dramatic gestures to pay attention. The key is knowing when to use them." A young woman entered the library hesitantly. She wore a military uniform. Her eyes were red, like she'd been crying. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't know anyone was here. I can come back." "No," David said gently. "Please." "Come in." She approached the memorial slowly. Read the plaque. Looked at James's photograph. "Did you know him?" she asked. "He was my son," David said quietly. The young woman's hand went to her mouth. "I'm so sorry. I came because—" Her voice broke. "I was going to do it tonight. I had it all planned. But then I saw the news about the new hotline. About this memorial. And I called instead." She looked at David with desperate gratitude. "They helped me. They listened. For the first time since I came back, someone actually listened. And I'm here because of your son. Because you fought for him." David couldn't speak. He simply pulled her into a hug while she sobbed. Charles watched quietly, his throat tight. This was why it mattered. This moment. This life saved. This future preserved when the young woman composed herself and left. Promising to attend her counseling session the next day, David turned to Charles. "How many like her?" David asked. "How many are out there right now, considering ending it?" "Too many," Charles said honestly. "But fewer now than 3 months ago. And even fewer in 3 months from now. Because of the systems we're building. Because of the awareness you created." David looked back at his son's photograph. "I miss him every day. Every single day. But knowing that his story is saving others," he struggled to find words. "It doesn't make it hurt less. But it makes it mean something." Charles placed a hand on David's shoulder. "He served with honor. And now, in death, he's still serving. Still saving lives? That's a legacy most soldiers never achieve. What about Brennan? David asked suddenly. The guardsman? How is he? Thriving, Charles said. He's connected 40 veterans to emergency services in his first month, prevented at least 6 crises. Apparently, having made a life-threatening mistake makes him incredibly vigilant about not missing warning signs.
Good, David said.
I felt terrible about putting him in that position. Told me last week that it was the best thing that ever happened to him, Charles said. That guarding gates was important, but this work makes him feel like he's truly protecting people. They stood together a while longer. 2 men from completely different worlds, brought together by tragedy and transformed by each other. Your Majesty, David said finally. Thank you. For losing your temper that day, for scaring me to death, for caring enough to be angry, Charles smiled slightly. Thank you for breaking into my home, for refusing to be silent, for showing me what I'd been blind to. As they left the library together, the photograph of James Morrison remained on the wall, smiling, forever young. Forever in uniform, but no longer forgotten. And somewhere across Britain, another veteran picked up the phone instead of a weapon. Another family stayed whole. Another life continued because one father refused to give up, because one king chose to listen, and because sometimes the most important changes come from the most unexpected moments, even ones that start with a king losing his temper at Windsor Castle. The story ends where it began, at a gate with a guardsman making a choice, but now that choice leads somewhere different, to help instead of harm, to hearing instead of silence, to hope instead of despair, and in the end, that makes all the difference. The memorial in the East Library became something more than just a photograph on a wall. It became a symbol, a reminder, a promise that every veteran who serves deserves to be served in return, that every cry for help deserves an answer, that the crown they swore to protect will protect them always, without exception. No waiting lists, no form letters, no bureaucracy, just help, real help, when it's needed most, because that's what James Morrison deserved, and that's what his father fought for, and that's what a king learned to give. One dramatic, chaotic, beautiful day at Windsor Castle.